Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this video I'm going to go through everything you need to know about electoral systems in A-level politics. So the idea of this video is that it's going to give you everything you need to know. So that's kind of likely questions and debates that are going to come up, all the knowledge you need to know, all the kind of relevant examples you need to know, but not giving you too many where it becomes confusing. And then also all the kind of key arguments, analysis, evaluation that you could come up and you could use in essays. So the real key arguments on either side of the debate. So you can find the notes that are going to be in this video that you should be seeing up there in the link in the description to the Politics Explained website, where you'll also be able to find a place where you can access tutoring as well as lots of other resources, including essay plans to help you in A-level politics. So the timestamps for the different sections of this video you should be able to see in the description below. And what we're going to do, we're going to first look through kind of the parts of the specification this video is going to cover, then the key kind of essay questions and debates that can come up in relation to electoral systems. Then going to go into kind of different ways to judge electoral systems, so different criteria you can use, before going into the electoral systems you need to know in detail, and finally having a section comparing them, and then again looking at some of the kind of potential questions, essay questions and source questions to kind of recap and show how you can use what I'm going to kind of teach in the video in the exam if an electoral systems question comes up. So feel free to drop any kind of questions below, but without further ado, let's get into it. So firstly, the kind of parts of the specification this lesson covers. So this lesson covers everything in electoral systems apart from referendums. So 3.2 looks at referendums, and I'll do another video on that, but this covers kind of different electoral systems, so first past the post, AMS, STV, SV, and the advantages and disadvantages of all of them, as well as kind of really comparing them and then analysing them. So in terms of potential essay questions that could come up in relation to this question, there's kind of two key types. One of them's more focused around first past the post, and first past the post is obviously the electoral system we have in the UK, as I'm going to go through, but it's going to be focused more on the advantages and disadvantages of first past the post, and then comparing that to a more proportional system, and the arguments of whether first past the post should be scrapped and replaced with a more proportional system. And the other question, kind of type of question, which is potentially or arguably a little bit harder, is kind of more comparing all of the electoral systems more generally. Not necessarily all of them, but it could be a question like this one that came up. Evaluate the view that various electoral systems in use in the UK make significant differences to party representation. So rather than that being kind of focused on first past the post and comparing it to another more proportional system such as AMS or STV, that's more kind of comparing all the electoral systems and getting you to kind of give a judgment on all of them, but also the impact that they have, which makes it a little bit more difficult. And obviously you'd have slightly different structures and different approaches to each of them. But they're the kind of two key ones. One more focused on first past the post and comparing it to a more proportional system, and the other one more comparing less directly focused on first past the post and comparing all of the electoral systems more generally in their kind of impact. So, right, first getting into it. As I said, kind of the first part we're going to be looking into different ways to judge electoral systems, and this kind of includes different criteria with which to judge them, which is really useful when you get into an exam and you have to weigh up different electoral systems. It's kind of how good each of them are in these different criteria. So those criteria are voter choice, representation and proportionality, the link between the representative and the represented, and the type of government and politics that the electoral system leads to. So how are you going to use these? In an exam, you're going to be asked to weigh up the merits of different electoral systems and decide which you think is best. And using these and kind of how much each system delivers on each of these different criteria is a really good way to kind of evaluate and decide which one you think is the most effective, and then therefore kind of answer questions such as should first past the post be scrapped. So no electoral system is going to deliver on all of these criteria to the same degree, but the kind of question is kind of how different electoral systems kind of have different levels of each, and obviously something that has higher voter choice may lead to a different kind of government and politics. It could be seen as more negative or something like that, right? So it's about how they weigh them up and how having a high level of one may lead to a lower level of another. So firstly, voter choice. One key way to judge electoral systems is, of course, how much choice is given to voters. That includes a number of factors. So that's kind of how many votes voters get. So do they just get one vote? Do you get two? Do you get to rank your options? And whether you can vote for kind of more than one party or candidate, or even within a party, can you vote for different candidates? How many candidates and parties are standing? and kind of how much influence the votes have on the outcome. So how likely your vote is to be weighted effectively. The next one, and arguably the most important, is representation and proportionality. Because what's the point in having an electoral system if it's not democratic? So this is kind of how strong the link is between the votes and the outcome. So how strong a correlation there is. And so how proportional an electoral system is can be judged between this correlation between votes cast and seats won. And the closer the correlation, the more proportional the system. The next one is the link between the representative and the represented. So that's kind of how, obviously you have that kind of representation and proportionality and kind of a more data level, kind of how strong it is, how democratic it is, but also kind of how well does each representative represent a certain area or a certain community. So for example, first past the post is often seen as having a really strong MP constituency link because you have relatively small constituencies with one MP for each of them who represents them and responds to local interests. And then the final way to judge them is in terms of the type of government and politics that the electoral system leads to. So whether that's kind of, is it more likely to lead to coalition governments? Is it more likely to lead to single party governments? How strong are the governments? What kind of politics does it lead to in terms of, is it more adversarial? Is there more cooperation? And these are the kind of really key debates that often come up when you're weighing up first past the post versus more proportional systems. So what we're going to do now is look into different electoral systems in detail, starting with first past the post. So I'm going to go through first kind of what it is, where it's used, then going into kind of the key advantages and disadvantages, in which you'll have a lot of examples in there as well, which you can use in your essays. So firstly, where is first past the post used and how does it work? So first past the post is used in United Kingdom general elections and local council elections in England and Wales. The key one is, of course, UK general elections, the most important elections in the UK for most people. Voters cast a single vote just by placing a cross next to their preferred candidate in their constituency. And there are 650 constituencies, each of which elect one MP, one Member of Parliament, with the kind of average number of voters in a constituency roughly 75,000. There is some variation in that. For example, Isle of Wight's got 110,000 or 120,000, whilst there are some seats which have lower numbers as well, but it tends to be around 75,000. Though there are plans to reduce the number of constituencies down to 600, but those plans have been in place for a while since the coalition government and they still haven't materialised. It's a simple plurality system. That's a really important phrase, simple plurality system, that you're going to want to be using in your essays. So all that means is that the candidate with the largest number of votes in each constituency wins. So it doesn't matter if you kind of get only 30% of the vote in the constituency. If you've got more, if that 30% is more than anyone else, everyone else has got kind of 20%, 25%, you still win, right? So you don't need a majority in the constituency. That is quite important and really comes into a lot of disadvantages that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And then the government is then formed by the party or number of parties, if it's a coalition, right? With a majority of MPs in Parliament. So 650 MPs, therefore to get elected, you need, do some maths here, 326 MPs in order to get elected. So that's what a party needs. And how do the elections take place? They take place at the discretion of the Prime Minister. They have to happen at least every 5 years by law, but often they happen kind of every 4 years because the Prime Minister will, and the government will choose to hold an election at a time that works for them. So, firstly, looking at the advantages of first past the post. The first one is its speed and simplicity. So it's really easy to use for voters. You go in, you cast one vote for the kind of party and candidate that you want, and the result is kind of known very quickly. It's usually known early in the morning after polling day, and then the government's really quickly formed. So you got a couple of examples here. In 1997, Tony Blair arrived at Downing Street as the new PM at 1 p.m. the day after the election. So in comparison to some coalition systems, or not coalitions, some more proportional systems which lead to coalitions, which take a lot longer to form, first past the post is really quick and simple. And that can really give the impression of of democracy as well. And it can really give the impression that voters, their vote matters, right? Especially you have a change in government. And this kind of simplicity and familiarity can be seen as one of the key reasons why first past the post has been kept by the electorate. So in 2011, there was a referendum on AV, the alternative vote system, which is a more proportional system, but it was kind of rejected by the public with only a 42% turnout, but 68% of those who did vote voted against it. So as I said, a kind of more proportional system where coalitions are more likely, forming a government often takes longer. So it's kind of a lot quicker. First past the post is really quick. So for example, in Scotland, Scottish Parliament elections, which use AMS, which we're going to go through later in the video, it often takes around 2 weeks, and you've got an example of that here, to form a government after the election. So that's the first one, that it's kind of really quick and simple to use. The next kind of often cited kind of key advantage of first past the post is that it leads to strong single party governments. So first past the post leads to a two-party system that gives voters a clear choice and usually results in a clear majority for one party, which then really does have a strong mandate to carry out its election manifesto. You see that in kind of Thatcher massively changed the economy, huge changes to public life and to the economy, to politics. You also see that in Blair after 1997, who kind of really made very significant reforms to the constitution. So you have these very strong governments, often single party, vast majority of the time single party, and they really can carry out what they want to do. And that can be seen as a real benefit, because you have effective change and you don't have kind of deadlock and issues not being properly addressed. The obviously clear counterpoint to that is that if that's a minority of the population that's voted for that government, then they're effectively doing it without the legitimacy to do so. But some people argue that it's worth it, and it can be argued that that kind of strength of government is enough of an advantage. So it's that kind of strong governments, but also that two-party system could be seen as a real benefit, right? Because you have a clear alternative all of the time, which can lead to governments being accountable, because there's always a different party that can be elected. And also, one argument that Ken Clark makes is that it forces voters to face up to a fundamental choice. So, for example, in 2019, because you have two parties, it's a two-party system, in 2019, where the key issue of the election was Brexit, really was focused around Brexit, each party took a different stance, pretty much on either side of it, right? Second referendum versus get Brexit done. And you have that decided, and then you have that entrenched. And that can be seen as a real benefit, because it leads to UK politics properly addressing issues rather than avoiding them. Two more advantages. The third one is the exclusion of extremist parties. So one benefit of first past the post, and the fact that it's a two-party system, and the fact that kind of smaller parties are really disadvantaged, which we'll see in the disadvantages section, is that extremist parties really struggle to do well. So they're much less likely to have success, as first past the post requires geographically concentrated support. So this can be explained kind of by how it works, right? So if, say, a party such as UKIP, which it did have a lot of support, if that is spread, say it has 10% support across the country, but that's spread evenly across the country, they're only going to have 10% in each constituency, and they're very unlikely to win a constituency, because you need to get the most in a constituency. So if your support isn't geographically concentrated, it's very difficult to do well. And because of that, you see a lot of smaller parties whose support isn't geographically concentrated doing really badly. For example, the British National Party, a far right party, won 2% of the national vote in 2010, but didn't finish higher than third in any constituency, so came nowhere near to getting any MPs, let alone anywhere near to kind of getting a significant section in Parliament. And that could be compared to, and UKIP were really disadvantaged as well, and that could be compared to a more proportional system such as in Germany, where AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, are also a pretty right-wing party, probably similar to UKIP, where UKIP can be put on a similar level, were able to be very successful and gain a really key role in Parliament as a kind of a key opposition party. I've got an example there of the BNP doing well in a more proportional system in European Parliament elections, but obviously they didn't get any seats in first past the post. The final kind of key advantage of first past the post is the MP constituency link, which I mentioned kind of earlier in the video. The relatively small size of most first past the post constituencies, and the fact that a single MP is responsible for those who live within the constituency, so you have one MP for each constituency, result in really effective representation of local interests and a real strong link between the constituency and the MP. So there can be some counterpoints to that, but it does seem to work relatively well. For example, in October 2022, Liz Truss's government tried to vote against a ban on fracking that was proposed by Labour, the opposition. And you had 33 Conservative MPs rebelling against Liz Truss's government, the Conservative government's insistence on kind of voting against it. And a lot of those had local groups very opposed to fracking in the area. For example, MP Mark Fletcher of Bolsover had a real strong local movement against fracking in the area, with lots of local pressure groups against it and clear public opposition in his constituency to it, and he voted against it. So you see that real strong MP constituency link, and that also comes in constituency surgeries. So MPs handle kind of correspondence from their constituents and hold weekly constituency surgeries where they kind of seek to help their constituents and address any of their issues. Okay, so now going into the disadvantages. The key disadvantage of first past the post is that it's very unproportional. So I've broken that down into a couple of ways, right? So the first one is the lack of representation in constituencies. So over half of MPs typically don't command a majority of support within their constituency. So that's kind of as a result of the fact that it's a simple plurality system. So you often have, very often have, more votes cast against the winning candidate than for them, and even lower support if you take into account turnout. So, for example, in the 2015 election, Alistair MacDonald of the SDLP in Northern Ireland won with just 24.5% of the vote in Belfast South, and only polled 14.7% of the electorate if the 60% turnout is taken into account. So that can be really seen as very unproportional, right? And really weakening the mandate of each MP, leading to many voters feeling unrepresented and MPs lacking legitimacy, because they really often have not that much support within their constituency and often don't have a majority of support, and more people opposed to them in their constituency than voting for them. This then kind of, when you extrapolate that up to the national level, leads to a real lack of proportionality at the national level. And that comes in a number of key ways. I've broken this down into kind of two key ways. So the lack of representation in constituencies leads to this lack of proportionality at the national level, with votes really not translated into seats with any real accuracy, leading to many voters feeling that the system lacked legitimacy. The key reason for that is because candidates who come second or third in a constituency, or fourth or fifth, of course, with significant votes, so they might get 20%, 30% of the vote within a constituency, don't get rewarded for that at all. So if, say, Labour finish second in a constituency and get 30% of the vote, and the Conservatives get 40%, the Conservatives win, but those 30% of voters in the constituency who want a Labour government, it doesn't matter. Their vote doesn't really get counted in relation to MPs. So that has two key effects. The first one is that it exaggerates the support of the biggest party, often called the winner's bonus. That's a really good phrase you can use. So the winner almost always enjoys a share of seats in excess of the share of the vote it receives. So that's because the party will often win a lot of the marginal seats between the two parties, and therefore kind of really have many more seats than votes. And that kind of determines the election outcome, those marginal seats. So in 2019, the Tory party won 56% of the seats, a pretty big majority, with just 43.6% of the vote. A real disconnect there. They get a real bonus from it. And just a couple more examples you've got there. In 2005, the Labour Party won 54.6% of the seats, another pretty big majority, with just 35.2% of the vote. So it can be really can be seen as a very unproportional system. And it has even happened in the past where the biggest party hasn't got the most votes out of any party, in February 1974 and in 1951. So the flip side of that, kind of the biggest party really getting a bonus and getting an advantage, is that first past the post really doesn't help a lot of smaller parties who don't have geographically concentrated support. So as I said, that can be seen as a benefit because it excludes extremist parties, but it can also be seen as a real democratic deficit and a real disadvantage. Lib Dems have historically just been really disadvantaged by this. So in 2019, they won 11.5% of the vote, but just 11 seats. So that's 1.7% of the seats. If the system was fully proportional, they should have got 75 seats. So real kind of lack of democracy there for smaller parties and lack of representation of a lot of people who do want those smaller parties to win. In 2015, UKIP, and another really good example, is UKIP won 3.9 million votes, so 12.6% of the votes, but just got one MP out of 650 MPs. So it really does disadvantage these smaller parties. And that contrasts with some smaller parties who do really well out of it. For example, the SNP, because they have geographically concentrated support just in Scotland, they really benefit from first past the post. So they won just 50% of the vote in Scotland in 2015, but 95% of the seats. So that can be seen as really unproportional and undemocratic. So yeah, first past the post really is quite unproportional, and also doesn't reflect the fact that the share of the vote that the two main parties get has really been decreasing for some time. So the next disadvantage is limited voter choice. So under first past the post, each party puts forward one candidate in each constituency, and there's no choice between different strands of the main parties, which are described as broad churches, right? They're pretty much the whole political system, because it's a two-party system in which they receive the majority of the votes, and you can't choose effectively. You can't choose between someone on Corbyn's wing of the party in Labour versus Starmer's wing of the party, who's seen as a lot more centrist. So you can't choose between people in the kind of real strong, hard Brexiteer wing of the Conservative Party from people who are a lot more One Nation, and that can be seen as kind of a real lack of voter choice, because voters only get one vote, and they also don't choose who's standing in their MP in their constituency, which MP standing in their constituency from each party. Yeah, so unlike kind of AMS or STV, they can't rank their choices or get a number of votes, one for a constituency, one for a party. And that also leads to kind of votes that for the party that doesn't win in a constituency are effectively wasted, because they don't really translate into the outcome. They don't result in anyone being elected. And that results in a lot of tactical voting as well, this kind of single plurality system, with many voters who live in constituencies in which their preferred party is highly unlikely to win, voting for a different party to try and prevent their least favourite party winning in a constituency. And tactical voting could be seen as a real disadvantage, right? Because voters are prevented from voting for the party they actually support. And YouGov kind of did a report and some investigation into this, and found out that in 2019, 32% of voters voted tactically. So that can be seen as a real disadvantage of first past the post. Also, votes are of greatly unequal value. So that's not only because there's kind of some difference in the size of constituencies, but also because of the difference between safe and marginal seats. So if you're in a safe seat, and a safe seat is where kind of one party is most likely to win, right? So somewhere in the southeast where the Conservatives often do very well, somewhere in like Liverpool, Manchester, where the Labour often do really, really well. So I think it's in Bolsover or a lot of Liverpool seats have around 75%, 80% support for Labour, and Labour are only pretty much Labour who are ever going to win in those constituencies, and they can be seen as having a lot less kind of importance. Like one vote in each of those constituencies can be seen as a lot less important than in more marginal seats, right? Where it's a lot closer, and every vote, every turnout matters. And what that leads to is to depressed turnout in safe seats, where people feel like their vote doesn't really matter, and increased turnout in marginal seats. And that obviously leads to kind of differences in kind of whose vote matters, which can be seen as a negative, because you can kind of more likely to turn out, and your vote is going to matter more in a marginal seat than if you're in a safe seat. So yeah, it has an impact on turnout, which is really important. The final one is a bit more of a counterpoint, and that's that kind of first past the post can be seen as ineffective at choosing government, right? You kind of have this kind of key advantage often cited, that it leads to strong single party governments. But single party governments can be seen as negative, right? Why is a single party government necessarily a good thing? Maybe it can be seen as a lot more effective to have a coalition government where you have a lot more support across the country, and where you have negotiation and compromise in political decision making, rather than strong decision making on the left or the right, or on one particular side of the political spectrum. Also, even if you think that single party government and strong single party government is really effective, which I think can definitely be a persuasive argument, first past the post hasn't always been successful in delivering that, particularly in the last couple of decades. So in 2010, there was obviously the coalition government from 2010 to 2015, where no party won a majority. And in 2017, Theresa May's government, Theresa May's second government, you had a confidence as a supply agreement between the DUP and the Conservative Party, so an effective minority government for the Conservative Party, which was very weak and was often defeated. So first past post, even in these kind of seen advantages, can be seen as ineffective in kind of choosing governments, especially recently. So finally, kind of why is first past the post used? It's effectively used because it's always been used, right? It survived largely because it suits the interests of the two main parties who have monopolised government since World War II, Labour offered a referendum on first past the post in their 1997 election manifesto, but once they won a huge majority under Tony Blair, they had no incentive to deliver it. So you see, it benefits the two main parties, and that's why it's largely stayed. But of course, there is also the fact that there is public support for it in the 2011 AV referendum. There was public support for first past post, or at least public rejection of changing it to a more proportional system. Okay, so now moving on to AMS, the additional member system. So, where is AMS used and how does it work? AMS is used in elections to the Scottish Parliament, Welsh Assembly, and Greater London Assembly, so really key devolved bodies. Voters have two votes, one for a constituency representative elected using kind of a similar first past the post system, so a simple plurality system for that first vote, and another vote for a party. So you go in and you vote one time for your local constituency for a member of parliament who's also going to belong to a party, but then you also have a second vote where you just choose between parties. And the idea is that that second vote, where you just vote for a party, corrects the first past the post element, corrects the first vote overall, and makes it a more proportional system. And that's using the D'Hondt formula. So it kind of really determines how many members a party should be allocated from that second vote, which is the kind of party list vote. This formula gives parties who are underrepresented in the constituency element greater representation in the kind of party list vote, and vice versa. So there are fewer list members than constituency representatives because the list ones is seen as more of a corrective to the overall system, and they're hence known as kind of additional or top-up members. So in the Scottish Parliament you have 129 members, 73 of which are constituency members and 56 of which are list members. So the advantage of this is that the top-up party list element introduces an element of proportionality that corrects the disproportionality of first past the post that I was just talking about, right? And leads to a very proportional system overall. So you can see that in this example. In 1999, in the Scottish Parliament election, the Conservative Party won 0 constituency MPs from that kind of first vote, right? Despite getting 15.6% of the vote across Scotland. Because obviously it was kind of spread across Scotland, they weren't able to get the most in any constituency and therefore got 0 MPs. If it was just a first past the post system, they would have got 0 MPs overall and that would have been it. But because they got a similar share of the vote in the party list, they were given 18 additional member seats to correct, because of that vote in party list, but also even more than that, to correct the fact that they received fewer or they were really disadvantaged in the constituency vote. And that led them to receiving 14% of seats overall, which is pretty similar to the around 15.6, 16% of the vote that they received overall in the kind of constituency and party list vote. So that's compared to 1997 UK Parliament election, where they had a similar share of the vote in Scotland, but got 0 MPs in Scotland because of it. So that's the first one. It makes it more proportional. It's kind of a top-up and corrective to the disproportionality of the first past the post constituency element. The second one is that the constituency element ensures a strong MP constituency link remains, right? So you still may have majority MPs that have constituencies, right? One member have the same benefits of first past the post. So you still have that strong MP constituency link. Thirdly, voters have a wider choice than in first past the post, right? So you can vote for a split ticket if you want to. So you can vote for one party in your constituency vote and then a different party in the party list vote. So that means that you can split your ticket and really reflect your preferences more, and your vote's less likely to be wasted. So say I'm in a constituency where the Conservatives are never going to win in Scotland, I still might vote for them in the constituency, but then I can also vote for them in the party list, and my party list vote is going to have more impact and be more likely to result in a Conservative MSP being elected. And kind of, so for example, in 2021, in the Scottish Parliament election, the Greens won just 1.29% of the constituency votes, but 8.12% of the top-up votes, and got 8 seats as a result. Though they do game the system slightly by intentionally standing few constituency candidates to benefit from the top-up element. But nonetheless, it did show that there were people who voted for a different party for the constituency vote than they did for the party list vote and benefited because of it. in terms of the voter choice they were given. So it can seen as having higher voter choice than first past the post. Again, leads to, as I said, kind of less votes wasted than under first past the post. And finally, kind of the worst predictions made by critics of proportional systems, proportional representation, haven't been fulfilled. So coalition governments in Scotland and Wales have proved relatively stable, and there haven't been frequent changes of government. And you've had kind of quite effective governments, even though they have often had to work through more negotiation. You have had minority and coalition governments kind of delivering significant reforms. For example, which I'll mention in the devolution video, which you should also look at on the channel. The Scottish government recently changed its tax so that higher and the top rates of income tax are now 2% higher in Scotland than they are in the UK, in the rest of the UK, sorry. So you do have these real significant political changes by Scottish and Welsh governments. So kind of the idea that kind of proportional representation is going to lead to chaos and coalition governments hasn't really been fulfilled, because you've had really stable governments that have lasted kind of 5 years' time each. Now, on to the disadvantages. One kind of potential disadvantage is that it creates two different types of member. So one with constituency responsibilities and one without, right? On the other hand, there isn't really much evidence that that leads to kind of the second category, the kind of ones from the party list, having less legitimacy. Kind of a second one is that a closed list system is used for this kind of second vote. For this second vote, which is for the party. So say the Conservative Party are given 15 MPs from that vote. Before the election, or 15 MSPs, or kind of depending on whether it's in Wales, right? Before that election, they will have ranked, say, 50, a list of MPs, and they'll rank them in order. And if they get 15, the top 15 will get elected. If they get 20, the top 20 will get elected. But it's the party that chooses that ranking before the election, and that could be seen as a negative, because voters don't influence that, right? And that also means that because the party leadership chooses that, the party leadership has a lot of control over the party, especially for that second vote, right? And that can be seen as limiting the kind of chances of dissident members in a party being able to get elected, and therefore lead to parties being less broad churches than they are in first past the post, for example. On the other hand, it can be seen as an advantage. The fact that kind of you have that controlled party list can lead to kind of efforts to better represent ethnic minorities, to better represent women in politics, and other groups, right? So you have zipping is often used, where you have lists alternate between male and female MPs, or male and female candidates, sorry. Another disadvantage, it's the second one on this list, is that there are sometimes too few seats for the top-up element to correct the constituency element effectively and represent smaller parties. That's especially true in the GLA, in the Greater London Assembly, and also especially true in Wales, where you only have 60 MPs total, 20 of which are kind of those top-up members of Parliament. So the fact that there is still a bias towards constituency MPs can result in a less representative system overall than could be possible. This is less of a problem in Scotland than it is in Wales and in London. So, for example, in the 2021 Senate election in Wales, the Green Party won 1.6% of the constituency vote and 4.4% of the top-up vote, but they won no seats. So 4.4% of the top-up vote is quite a lot, right? But it's still not the 5% threshold needed, because you have only 20 top-up MPs. So that can be seen as one way in which it's not as proportional, especially for those smaller systems, for smaller parties. And then finally, AMS is more likely to lead to more minority and coalition governments, which can be seen as weak, right? And that can be seen as a disadvantage if you think strong single-party governments are an advantage, even if they're kind of not that proportional or not that representative. So in the sixth Scottish government since devolution was introduced in 1998, 3 have been coalition governments, whilst 2 have been minority governments. So only 1 majority government in there. So finally, why is AMS used in elections to the Scottish Parliament, Welsh Assembly and Greater London Assembly? It's because it was chosen as a compromise that would kind of maintain that constituency element, but also be more representative, right? And not involve the kind of radical change that kind of STV was seen as, because STV really does never result in majority governments effectively. And it's also that Labour, who introduced it, kind of expected it would keep them in government and maintain their power in Scotland, which they had a real majority, real stronghold in Scotland in 1997. It did do that until 2007, but since then, with the rise of the SNP, their vote has really collapsed there. Okay, so now moving on to the third electoral system we're going to look at. And this is the third of the kind of the real most important ones. There is SV afterwards as well, but it's kind of less important in the syllabus. And this one is single transferable vote, which is used in kind of most importantly is used in elections for the Northern Ireland Assembly. It's also used in Scottish Council elections. So it uses multi-member constituencies. So in the case of Northern Ireland Assembly, there are 18 multi-member constituencies, each of which have 5 members. And voters number their choices preferentially. And in order to get elected, a candidate needs to achieve a quota arrived at using the Droop formula, which divides the number of votes cast by the number of seats contested plus 1. So for example, in Northern Irish seats, where you have 5 in each seat, you need 20% of the vote to get elected, first of all, right? Then what happens is that the second and third and fourth kind of, well, first the second preferences are taken into account. So say you have, after just the first preferences are taken into account, and you only have 3 people who get at least 20% of the vote and are elected, then people's second preference votes are taken into account to see who else can then get over 20% of the vote. And it's done that until you have the 5 MPs filled or the 5 seats filled. And it leads to a very, very proportional system where very few votes are wasted, right? Because say you only have, in first past the post, where you only have 1 MP per constituency, if you kind of don't vote for the one with the most votes, your vote doesn't matter, right? But if you've got 5 MPs for each constituency, your vote is a lot more likely to matter. So say in a constituency, if 20% of people vote for a party, in first past the post, that won't matter, right? Because that 20% isn't going to be the most and their votes will be wasted. Whereas in STV, that will lead to 1 MP being elected and be very proportional. So it's quite a complex counting process using the Droop formula that takes into account different preferences, but it results in a very proportional system, and you don't need to know the complete ins and outs of it. So in terms of advantages, STV is a very proportional system with a very close correlation between votes and seats. So it's the most proportional system, even more so than AMS, and a lot more so than first past the post, as I'll see in kind of a comparison at the end of the video. Voter choice is also really high, so voters can choose between candidates standing for the same party as well as between candidates from different parties. And they also rank all of their kind of candidates preferentially, effectively giving them multiple votes. In Northern Ireland, it's created power-sharing governments, which allows representatives of 2 rival communities, so nationalists and unionists, to kind of work together in government, which was really necessary after the Troubles and the conflict in Northern Ireland. And it has helped to end 30 years of the Troubles and achieve a kind of relatively stable peace. And the governments always have majority support because it relies on that cooperation between the 2 communities, between representatives of 2 communities, sorry. So it's the same in Scottish local elections. So after the 2022 Scottish local elections, 94% of the councils had no overall control, so no majority. So it really does result in coalition systems where you need support from a number of parties, or definitely support from a majority of the population. In terms of disadvantages, in these large multi-member constituencies, the member constituency link can be seen as weaker than if you have kind of 1 MP for each constituency, for which are smaller constituencies, right? On the other hand, in Northern Ireland, that's a benefit, and that's kind of why it was really chosen in Northern Ireland. That's a benefit because that representation is more of communities rather than of geographical constituencies in Northern Ireland, as it isn't kind of, it's a lot more focused on geography in the UK general elections in general, for example. Power sharing governments may bring rival groups together, and that can be a benefit, especially in Northern Ireland, but they're still very prone to government, right? So this is some of the negatives you can see of coalition governments. So the Northern Irish Executive has been suspended several times, and STV doesn't help the more centrist parties in the long term. So the DUP, Democratic Unionist Party, and Sinn Féin now dominate in Northern Irish politics. They're the more kind of extreme wings of each community, or more further to the extremes parties within each community, with more centrist parties such as the SDLP benefiting at first, but now kind of not so much. And the final disadvantage is that counting votes is really slow and it's pretty complicated, right? Understanding the results is very difficult. So that can be seen as a real drawback, especially in comparison to first past the post. So why was it chosen where it was? So it's chosen for Northern Ireland because it's a highly proportional system, right? That includes, that kind of leads to real broad, effective representation of different parties and of different groups of the population. So it's really important to avoid single party domination, and STV really does do that. And yeah, as I said, the lack of single member constituencies is less of a problem as representatives represent kind of religious communities more than they do geographical communities. So they're the three key ones: first past the post, AMS and STV. There's also on the syllabus SV, which is used to elect kind of London mayors and other elected mayors. So we'll go through that quickly, but those first three are the most important ones and the ones you're probably going to be citing, well, definitely going to be citing most in essays. So where is it used and how does it work? This is for Supplementary Vote, SV. So it's used in elections for the London mayor and other elected mayors, and it used to be used for police and crime commissioners in England and Wales. So that was kind of recently scrapped and switched back to first past the post by Boris Johnson's government, I think. Each voter is allowed a first and a second preference, and any candidate who receives more than 50% of the first preference votes is elected automatically. If that doesn't occur, then all candidates except the top two are eliminated, and second preference votes for the two candidates are added to produce an overall winner. So yeah, very much just for individuals, right? So it's used for mayors. It could be used kind of in each constituency in first past the post as well. So advantages: it ensures broad support for the winner. So Sadiq Khan has a really strong mandate, personal mandate, because he has a majority of London, right? Especially if you take into account those second preference votes. Secondly, it's simple and it's straightforward to use for voters. And it gives voters greater choice than first past the post because you get a first and a second preference. And it's also allowed some independent candidates to win. So this is less true of kind of elected mayors and especially in London, especially for the London mayor. But when it was used for police and crime commissioners, 12 out of the 40 elected police and crime commissioners were independents in the 2012 contest. In terms of disadvantages, the winner doesn't need to get an absolute majority of the votes cast. Secondly, to have influence over the outcome, voters need to be able to identify the likely top two candidates, which isn't always clear. So, with the exception of London, right, because it's normally Labour versus Conservatives in London, because that means that, so say if I voted for two minor parties, so I voted for Lib Dems and the Greens, my vote effectively wouldn't matter in London, right? Because after the first one, it gets whittled down to the top two, and if my second preference vote isn't for one of those top two, my vote is effectively wasted. For like kind of another disadvantage is that it's more that the least unpopular candidates are more likely to win than the most popular, right? Because it takes into account those second preference votes. So a candidate could get elected who gets fewer first preference votes, but because of the second preference votes, which they might get more of, does get elected, and that can be seen as a negative. And finally, if SV was used in constituencies in UK Parliament elections, the problem would still remain of votes being wasted. So there'd be less wasted than under first past the post, but those kind of, what I just said in terms of if I voted for two minor parties, those votes would still be wasted. Why was it chosen? Kind of both SV and AV was considered, but SV was chosen largely because it was simpler to use. Okay, so finally, I'm going to again go back and look at comparing the systems based on the criteria I mentioned at the start of the video. So this is just comparing AMS, STV, and first past the post, because they're those kind of two more proportional ones are the more ones you're likely going to use in comparison to first past the post rather than SV. So firstly, in terms of voter choice is the highest in STV, the lowest in first past the post, with AMS somewhere in the middle, right? So the fact that voters kind of can indicate all of their preferences in STV, and the fact that very few votes are wasted, means that it's really kind of effective voter choice in STV. Whilst AMS leads to greater choice than first past the post, as voters get two votes in AMS, and the fact that it's corrective, the kind of party list vote is corrective of the constituency vote, means that kind of less votes or fewer votes are wasted. In both systems, yeah, it results in fewer votes being wasted in both STV and AMS compared to first past the post. In STV, it's even more because you can choose between candidates of the same party. rather than just between different parties. So you could rank your top three Sinn Féin MPs before going into any other parties, right? Or your top five likely Sinn Féin MPs and see which ones you prefer. Voter choice, though, can be seen as being at the expense of simplicity and ease of use for voters. So, first past post is very simple, and that can result in you could argue that results in UK Parliament elections having higher turnout, though that can also be attributed to the fact that they're effectively more important for a lot of voters. So, for example, in 2007 in Scotland, nearly 150,000 ballots were incorrectly completed. So, that can be seen as a result of the kind of difficulty of use for voters. So secondly, representation and proportionality. STV is the most proportional system, with first past the post the least proportional system by quite a way, and AMS more proportional than first past the post, though less than STV. And AMS is also more proportional for Scottish Parliament elections because they have more MPs, right? So that corrective can have more of an impact. And as I mentioned, the disadvantages of AMS than in kind of Welsh elections or GLA elections. So on average, first past the post deviates over 20% from the mean. So that's 20% from the kind of a direct correlation between votes and seats, compared to 11% for AMS in Scotland, 15% for AMS in Wales, and only 7% for STV in Northern Ireland. So STV really is the most proportional system, with first past the post by quite a way the least proportional. So in STV, the Droop formula and multi-member constituencies mean it's highly proportional, whilst you can see the same for the corrective top-up element of AMS. That is the key criticism of first past the post, right? Is its disproportionality. So this is a real key thing to compare on. And proportionality can be seen as being at the expense of single party government, though, and the speed of government selection process. So that's the kind of counterpoint you could definitely bring in. And as I said, UK Parliament elections do have highest turnout as well. So that can be taken into account as well. In terms of the link between the representative and the represented, first past the post has the strongest link, whilst AMS has a strong link and STV has a weaker link due to its multi-member constituencies. So in first past the post, all members are constituency representatives and can therefore be seen as having a strong link to their constituency, a strong local representation. In AMS, not all members do, leading to relatively larger constituencies and therefore a slightly weaker link. And this is weaker under STV, with multi-member constituency being too large for their representatives to know well, arguably. On the other hand, the kind of absence of safe seats under STV makes candidates work harder for votes, so they kind of have to address the concerns of their constituency, whereas first past the post encourages parties to focus on key marginal seats at the expense of others. So that's a kind of real counterpoint where you could argue that actually first past the post can be seen as less effective in terms of MP constituency link. The importance of kind of this local representation or the MP constituency link shouldn't be overstated, though, as well, as many voters vote based on parties and party leaders rather than local MPs, especially if that's what the media generally focuses on and what's likely to have the most impact on people's lives. Finally, looking at the type of government and politics. So STV results in coalition power sharing government, and that's what it's designed to do. And it's done so very effectively in Northern Ireland. Though that can be seen as an advantage or a disadvantage, right? A lot of first past the post supporters would see that as a disadvantage, though arguably in the context of Northern Ireland, that could be seen as more of an advantage. And the level of shutdowns or the frequency of shutdowns within those coalition governments in Northern Ireland can also be seen as quite specific to Northern Ireland, due to the tension between the different communities and parties. Despite kind of recent exceptions, first past the post does usually result in strong single party governments that can carry out their election manifestos with little need for cooperation and a very kind of conflictual political system. So some people see that as an advantage, right? That shouldn't necessarily be seen as a benefit, though, especially as if you have a really strong government, single party government, that can be a good thing. But if it doesn't have majority support within the population, it doesn't have that legitimacy, right? And it can therefore carry out changes, really significant changes, without much support, and can be seen as creating kind of an elected dictatorship. That contrasts with AMS, right, which normally has minority or coalition governments, though they have been relatively stable, especially in Scotland, and in Wales as well. These governments often take longer to form than first past the post, but yeah, as I said, they have been largely stable, with kind of negotiations being more how politics works in these countries, as kind of the government often doesn't have a majority or is in a coalition. So, for example, when the SNP was in minority government in February 2011, to pass its budget, they made concessions to the Lib Dems and Conservatives on kind of measures to increase youth employment and training, with kind of criticisms from the Lib Dems and Conservatives that its budget wasn't doing enough for that. So that can be seen as kind of where negotiation and compromise is more embedded into the political system and how politics works. The extent of consensual politics shouldn't be overstated, though. In Scotland, for example, there's been consistent conflict between parties of, particularly on independence, and it is still a very adversarial form of politics, in the same way it is in the UK under first past the post. And kind of finally, in terms of how long the elections take, votes do take longer to count under STV and AMS than they do under first past the post. If you want to pause the video, you can see there's a kind of comparison between list kind of complete proportionality, AMS, STV, and first past the post for the 2019 election, and how the results would have been different under those two different systems if they were used. And that was kind of calculated by the Electoral Reform Society. Effectively, what it shows is that AMS and STV would have been much more proportional, right? The Conservatives would have got fewer seats. There wouldn't have been that winner's bonus, which I mentioned. Smaller parties would have been benefited, or would have benefited particularly the Lib Dems, the Brexit Party, and the Green Party. The SNP would have got fewer seats because it wouldn't benefit from the kind of how geographically concentrated its vote would have been. And interestingly, actually, Labour, AMS, and STV go different ways in relation to kind of how many seats Labour would have got. So, also got some kind of potential questions there you could practice in relation to electoral systems. The two ones I kind of recommend practicing are evaluate the argument that the first past the post electoral system should be scrapped and replaced with a more proportional electoral system, where you'd focus more on the advantages and disadvantages of first past the post. And evaluate the argument that first past the post is the most effective electoral system currently in use in the United Kingdom, where you might have it more focused on the criteria with kind of paragraphs on voter choice, proportionality, type of government and politics, and have more equal comparison between the different systems within that. If you go to the Politics Explained website, there will soon be those in the kind of UK politics essay plans. And if you've already purchased them, then they will come up there as well. Whilst if you kind of want to sign up for tutoring, that's the kind of thing we can do is work through those questions. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. Feel free to drop any kind of questions or comments below. And as I said, go to the Politics Explained website to access, if you want to access tutoring, if you want to access a lot of free and paid resources on the website to help you in your A-level politics, course, and hopefully help you achieve the best grade you can. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Make sure to subscribe as well and like the video, and make sure to kind of look out for future videos. Thank you.